Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Alcordev's number 133. We have a couple things today, so obviously a lot of time discussing Kiln and the latest merge updates. Then we have some updates on a bunch of EIPs we had previously discussed for Shanghai. So one around beacon chain withdrawals, which is actually a new EIP with a different approach. An update on the prototyping that happened for the shard blob transactions, and then finally an update on an EIP. We discussed this a while back, but the idea of having the Coinbase address be warm rather than cold with regards to gas costs. Then finally, we have, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name right now. Somebody from 1inch, apologies. Here to talk about another EIP which reprices reverted opcodes. Oh, Anton, yes, sorry about that. So Anton to talk about an EIP which reprices reverted operations. And then last thing, I'll give a quick shout out now, but we had been discussing how to call the execution layer client releases for the merge. So there's already a name for the consensus layer ones. Next week at the same time as this call, so 1400 UTC on Friday, we'll have a breakout room to discuss that. So if you have strong opinions about namings, this is where you should show up. Cool. So for Kiln, Maris, I saw you were in the Discord trying every possible client combination. Do you want to give a quick update? And then we can probably get others to chime in.
Yes, sure. So I've been trying to set up a document for all the different clients, the same way we did with Kintsugi, so that once we launch Kiln, the community can come together and run. Some of them haven't had proper auth support yet. Or they don't use auth for the normal operations that are not like the normal calls that are not part of the engine API spec. And so I think that's something that we need to discuss, whether we want, for example, the ETH calls on the engine API port, on the authenticated port, to also require authentication. And I would prefer that because that's way easier to implement for us. Or if we're going the route that some of the consensus layer clients chose to do the calls for the ETH calls without without authentication and only do the engine API calls with authentication. So maybe Mikhail has some thoughts about this.
Yeah, I mean, my opinion is that anything on that port should be authenticated, and I think that's probably how it's specified. And if it's not, it should be clarified.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. So it's like the authentication is for the endpoint, and the endpoint has two namespaces currently, which is engine and ETH, subset of ETH.
Yeah, this is Besu here. That's exactly how we read the spec, and that's how it's been implemented.
Cool. For another remind.
Yeah, we can circle back on that, make sure there's any clarifying text that needs to be there, and just also coordinate with the other side.
That's good. Okay. Yeah, and we also plan to maybe not run the unauthenticated endpoints, or we might choose not to run the unauthenticated endpoints, and that would break clients that don't have this. So yeah. Otherwise, it looks pretty good. Tiku and Lighthouse already support the authentication out of the box. Lodestar supports authentication for the engine calls, and I'm not 100% sure about Nimbus and Prism, there seems to be some issues with the authentication. That's it.
Cool. Thanks for sharing. Anyone else have updates on Kiln?
Maybe Perry on DevNet 5.
Sure. So we did launch merge DevNet 5 yesterday. The merge for Epoch has been hit earlier today, and we already found one issue with the client team that's looking into it. But TTD hasn't been hit yet. Most likely it would take another 2 or 3 days, and latest on Monday, we're just going to run a bunch more miners to hit the TTD. Tooling links are up. I'll post a link on chat, and we should have more information on Kiln sometime next week.
Cool. Yeah, and I guess related to Kiln, one thing to note is we'll do an announcement on the EF blog like we did with Kintsugi, kind of explain to the community what it is and whatnot. We'll link Meredith's doc, which has kind of the pairwise instructions between clients. But if client teams want to have like a one pager or short bit of documentation about how to kind of get Kiln running on their client, that's really helpful as well. And I'll reach out, or yeah, and we can include those for the teams that have it.
Also, my document will be extremely brief, so I think it's more for like really technical people, and it would be nice to have longer explanations for people that are not that into running stuff on the CLI and stuff. So if you're out there and you're interested in doing something for the merge and helping us out, then you can just create a blog post with your favorite combination and explain to the average user how they can set up a node on Kiln. That would be really great.
Yeah, very good point. And yeah, I guess just to kind of check in with the other teams, is everyone roughly on track for being ready to go on a more public Kiln version next week?
From my side, we are ready without. We tested it with one CL client, and we plan to launch the first nodes with Alf on merge DevNet 5 with Parry on Monday.
Cool. Oh, Andrew?
Well, I'm still working on fixing the tests in Hive. So like I've just realized that there are still things to be done in our code base. So we'll try to make it, but it's a bit uncertain.
Got it.
Basically, is on track for a Kiln release with or without auth next week.
Cool. Great. Anything else on Kiln or just the merge devnets that people wanted to discuss?
We actually have a small spec update. Is it okay to share it now?
Of course, yeah.
Oh yeah, cool. So we have like several PRs to the engine API. They are mostly clarification PRs. One of them sets quality of service to exchange transition configuration method, and this quality of service requires a bit of attention from implementation side. Also, we have a slight update to the optimistic sync spec, really slight one. All these updates are backwards compatible with the V2 version, and what we are about to do is to release all of this under V2.1 version. So it should be pretty much okay to have a DevNet or a testnet with V2, and then clients will be able to upgrade to V2.1 once each client is ready. So that's like the plan. And I guess we will have this v2.1 release early next week. That's the update.
Is it possible to have like a kind of very clear separation of V2 and V2.1 just in terms of the meta specs? Because we're probably going to link V2 if not linking it directly, it'll be like sublinked somewhere in the Kiln blog post. So just to make sure that like that link stays pointing towards V2 and V2.1 is like.
Yeah. Why not just link to V2.1? I guess, considering that these are all backwards compatible and don't change anything for end users.
I don't have a strong opinion. Just that people, I guess my reason is just like you don't want people to kind of look at the spec and then look at the clients and like there's a mismatch. But I don't have a strong opinion there. Nope.
Yeah, I think it will be just released like as a regular bump of Kiln version or Kintsugi version, but just v2.1 to reflect that it's backward compatible. Marius, yeah, I hear your question, and there will be like a few PRs in Engine API, a couple of them clarifying things and polishing them. One is setting the quality of service, which actually on the exchange transition configuration method, which actually for EL, from implementation side, it means that EL should fire a message in the log if CL hasn't triggered this method for 60 seconds or for 120 seconds. So this kind of stuff. So it's like to be sure that CL is really, that EL is driven by some CL. That's it basically for EL side.
Yeah, and on
we don't have Danny.
I was just saying on the optimistic sync side, there's a case in which you can be a little bit more liberal in what you're allowed to import, and so it's kind of expansive in that, and so the other it does not reduce the spec.
Yeah, good question. We don't have spec for finalized safe, latest, and unsafe yet. So it actually a slight change to the execution APIs. It's a matter of adding like these values to the enum that is already there in the spec. But in terms of implementation, it might be much more invasive.
Yeah, and I think that's a pretty big change on or might be a big change on the user side. So I would vote for like doing this spec pretty quickly so that we can implement it and then have the service providers and everyone testing this.
Yeah, to be clear, the user can do nothing because latest is still there, which, you know, it's the addition of the other two. But yeah, if they want to actually leverage the new functionality, they need to practice with it.
Yeah, the question is, do we want to have this for Kiln? And yeah, for the record, it can be implemented like Kiln testnet can be launched, and then this feature is implemented and deployed there. It's like not a blocker to launch.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should get it written down, and I think that people can roll it out, and that it should definitely be out by the public testnets, not Kiln, but the existing public testnets.
Yeah, I guess then if we want to have this for public testnets, we would like also to test it in Kiln, probably at the end of or in the middle of this.
Yeah, and I do think it seems like the biggest. So actually doing the JSON RPC spec is not like the biggest thing. I think the biggest challenge was actually getting the safe head exposed and kind of passed through the execution layer. and then kind of dealing with that in the execution layer. And so that, I guess that probably is something that like you want to do. You don't want to hold kiln on. Yeah.
Yeah, so both of these values are passed already. It's a matter of the execution layer then kind of tracking and tagging them as blocks and states that could be retrieved via those keywords.
Got it.
And
Right. Sorry, Maris.
The big problem that I faced when I started to implementing, I started implementing finalized. That was pretty easy. The issue is that latest currently just uses the internal blockchain object, and so we will return the unsafe head, and we can like if we I think having latest as the unsafe makes more sense because you want to build on top of latest. But yeah,
The vast majority of people who are using JSON RPC though are not building blocks. They are dApp developers or integrators and whatnot who very much do not want latest.
Yeah, but you want
unsafe head when they want latest.
But you want to create your transactions on top of latest. You want to have the nonce.
I don't think so. I think you want the safe head. Like, well, let me rephrase that. I think you're correct that you want your transactions to be executed against, like when it comes to like gas pricing, for example, latest or unsafe is going to give you a more correct gas pricing. However, for determining what the state of the universe is, like has a transaction final or is a transaction mined, so to speak, I think safe head is what basically every user wants.
Right.
And so ideally, dApps will switch to using safe and unsafe appropriately. And so the question is what is the default that most people are going to want most of the time? And I think safe is that.
Yeah, I guess I'm a bit mixed on this. I know we hashed this out months ago, but you know, the proof of work block in the first second is also something like unsafe in that it does get uncled. It's not rare for it to get uncled. So like the latest doesn't really imply that it's going to be there forever. Whereas if we had a new keyword that was safe, that then now is new and allows me to make like firmer decisions than block confirmations, 1v1 block confirmation, and allows me to make not quite as firm decision as finalists. But
as a counterpoint in proof of work, there's no balancing. So there isn't the danger that someone intentionally creates a block that is likely to be reorged.
I agree, but that is
I think it really depends on
the intention of a block that might be like I don't care about the intention. I just know that if I get ahead in proof of work, it might be uncled. But if it's
I think it depends mostly on the general use case for which people use the latest, and can it be like distinguished for some use cases where unsafe is the one thing that people want to use? Can it be like easily juggled in dApp and services that use JSON RPC?
Is it easier to implement safe as a separate endpoint than it is to like rewire latest?
Probably. I mean, I think what Marius was saying is latest is latest, and it's used in this like very particular way for certain things. Obviously, it's used also to read the state of the world. But if you just add safe and unsafe and kind of say, hey, stop using latest and be more particular about safe and unsafe in the future, that might be a path.
Right, because it feels like if we do want to get people to...
I mean, sorry, I'm a bit confused there because we are adding the new endpoint anyway. That's already is. Like, I mean, so this is not... I don't see the argument here.
No, the issue here is that whether you're wiring latest to be the tip of the chain as it is, or wiring it to be this thing that might lag.
But I mean, also another counterpoint to the earlier argument that latest is what you want to build the transaction on. Well, if you have a transaction that can only be built on latest, that is also not safe anyway, right? Like any transaction that assumes one particular state can simply fail to encounter that state when it's actually included.
But you want to build the nonce on top of what
So I think that I'm not too worried about your transit. Yeah, I don't think
I mean,
transaction
the
nonce are too
nonce
big a
is
deal.
what
Basically, every
you are.
wallet handles it. Yeah, the wallets handle the nonce and they track them internally. They don't use the node for that. So I'm not too worried about that particular aspect.
Yeah.
I think it depends. I think it depends a bit on whether you want to read or write the blockchain, and for writing the blockchain calls on like wiring latest to unsafe might be better, and for reading the blockchain wiring safe to safe might be better. Sorry, latest to safe might be better. And from like I remember that it used to be that we had like the most used call was ETH call, ETH estimate guess, so this stuff, and yeah.
So I think it depends on what type of user you are. If you are a MEV miner, for example, you're definitely going to want unsafe head. But I'm not too worried about defaults for those people. Those people can very easily change their code to use unsafe if that's what they want. What I'm more worried about is the average user who is not an Ethereum expert, barely understands what gas is, or probably doesn't understand what gas is. They're just trying to use some dApp or buy an NFT or whatever. And when it says their transaction has mined, like the completed, like they get that little ta-da thing at the end of their dApp that says, hey, you got your NFT or whatever it was you're trying to do is done now. I want that done to really mean done. And so for these users who are using dApps today, they're using latest because it's the only option. And that done doesn't actually mean done because there's reorg potential. But luckily, if we reorg, probably your transaction will still make it, but maybe not, depending on what you're doing. And so if we switch all those users over to safe, done means done in almost all scenarios, right? Like except for the very weird scenario where we actually have a safe head reorg, which can happen, but rarely will. Those users won't run into problems. And those are the ones that I think we should be optimizing defaults for, not the power users who, want to play with the very edge of the chain and they're, worried about, doing these Uniswap transactions or whatever that need to go in at the exact moment in time that the price moves or whatever. Like I think we should focus more on those users that don't know what Ethereum is, barely know what they're doing. They installed MetaMask and that's kind of it.
And one data point I can add in favor of that is it took us, it still takes a long time for even very popular apps to have like proper 1559 support. A lot of times, like I'll still use a random application and like the Web3 or Ethers version that they're using basically populates your transaction as a legacy transaction, even though it's been like 9 months since 1559 is live. So I think that if we can switch everyone by default, there's a large portion of applications that will provide a better UX that otherwise just might not. That said, I don't know. I guess the one thing I'd be curious to just understand a bit better is the engineering cost. Like, is it 10 times harder to rewire latest than it is to just have safe as a separate flag and latest kind of map the unsafe? That seems to also be important.
But I can't speak for all of the client teams, obviously, but from the client code base that I have looked at, generally, JSON RPC receives a message over JSON RPC, and when it's parsing those variables, you can do that aliasing right there, and it shouldn't matter what you're aliasing to.
Yeah, I guess it's only if like latest is also double used for things deep in the code base that aren't really related to JSON RPC.
Yeah, so I guess if from a naming perspective within a given client code base, it's certainly possible that a client may be using the word latest everywhere in their code base to refer to the unsafe head. And then it's kind of weird to have the JSON RPC have, some aliasing to safe head. I'm not terribly worried about that because you can do the aliasing like right as you enter, basically at the very edge, and so it shouldn't cause a problem in your code base overall. But again, this is can't speak to a specific client, just in general.
Given that safe and unsafe are almost equivalent, almost 100% of the time on mainnet, I'm not too concerned about the distinction of which one gets wired here. So I'm gonna withdraw my caring.
Yeah, and I guess
I just
yeah, go ahead, Miros.
I just took a look at our code, and I think we can pretty easily rewire it. So yeah, it should be okay.
Okay, and so there's a bunch of comments in the chat. So are we like roughly aligned? Obviously, finalize is there. Do we want to expose both safe and unsafe alongside latest? So to have like safe.
Yeah, I think the only contention from what I'm gathering is what will latest alias to. I think everybody sounds like there's an agreement. We will expose, finalize, safe, unsafe, and we just need to decide again what latest will alias to. Which of those?
And by default, it's probably makes sense to make it an alias to unsafe. To just, I mean, there are probably some patterns where latest, where it is expected that latest will return the head, like literally the tip of the chain. So, and if we change this semantics to, like to and make it not always the head, so probably some dApps and services will have to adjust their code bases to use the new tag.
I think, yeah,
I mean,
Micah's
yes,
argument
there
was
will
kind
be
of
some,
the
but I
opposite.
think,
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, there will be some, but those will be like professionals that care that much. Like the only people that care about a 4 to 6 seconds difference is like MEV miners, front runners, etc. And I really don't care about designing our system to favor them. I would much rather design our system to favor, the idiot that doesn't know what they're doing.
Yeah, I don't know.
I think they're the same people.
Wow. Yeah, I don't know. Personally, just based on the experience of rolling out 1559 and like the time it took to adopt, which was much longer than I expected, I would push a bit to having latest default to the safe head, because we kind of, with a bit more, I don't know, rewiring, we kind of give this extra security for free to like a bunch of end users who might not be aware about it. And that seems like a win. And otherwise, I suspect it'll take years for certain applications to update.
Yeah, I concur with the timeline. Like it's going to be many years before we see latest stop being used. And that's assuming that we can get all the docs updated to discourage its use.
Yeah, I think I agree. I do also agree with Mikhail that the change has the chance to break more things. Right. But if those are sophisticated users that can handle breakage, then I guess that's okay.
And that's why I think we should create the spec as soon as possible, implement it as soon as possible, so we can have users test it.
So I guess, does it make sense to go ahead with the assumption that latest is safe head, get that implemented as a high priority after Kiln? If we obviously see that something breaks in a way that is like very hard to fix or whatnot, we can change this decision. But yeah, at the very least, we'll know it once it's implemented, and I suspect once we fork the public testnets is when we'll get a lot of data about how real applications kind of react to this.
One question would be what happens in the case if we don't have a safe head yet. So, for example, in proof of work, we don't have a safe head. Then we need to do the latest back, rewire it
I would
back
assume-
to unsafe. So
I
that
mean,
should be in the
if
spec.
you're talking about like if you want to release your client with these endpoints ahead of the merge, which presumably you would want to do, right? Ideally, I would say like finalized is some number of confirmations and safe one confirmation, but that's I don't like that either. That's significantly longer than
You can also just
proof of
sweep it
stake.
under the rug and point safe and unsafe to the same thing.
Yeah,
Or
I
return
think
an error.
pragmatically that's what I would do.
I think it's very
I
weird
don't
to
know.
return something like a proof of work
I
value
don't
for
think-
finalized, because they're very different concepts.
I don't think we want to narrow it though, because we want people to update their dApps before the merge happens. That way, when the merge happens, they seamlessly transition into it. And so if finalized what makes sense for a particular dApp, they can start using finalized, like, which means something useful, like, 6 confirmations or whatever, or 10 confirmations or something that's, approximately
Genesis.
what finalized. So something that's useful to them and is kind of representative in terms of time scales that's similar to what finalized will be in the merge. That way their dApp can still work today, but they can have it merge ready. So as soon as the merge happens, they'll immediately start using the correct, safe, unsafe, finalized if they want.
So the spec can have, if these methods are exposed prior to the merge, these are recommended values.
Yeah, something like that.
I don't think we need to be super dictatorial on those recommended values.
Okay.
Not sure it will be easy to define these recommended values, so probably, yeah, I need to think about it.
We can discuss it in Discord. I'm happy to carry on this conversation more.
Cool. But just to be clear, do we have rough agreement that latest is safe head? Does anyone have like a strong objection to that?
I think that actually dApp developers should have this objection. Personally, I don't have an objection to have an alias with safe or unsafe. Just, yeah. Either way is good for me, personally.
Cool. Yeah, so I guess as soon as Kiln is released, this is probably the next big thing that we should be working on.
So latest is safe, right?
Yes, I think we go for that with that for now. If some infrastructure provider or application tells us this breaks everything in a very complicated way, we can change it. But assuming that that's not the case, yeah, we can just go ahead with this.
Yeah, one thing to clarify here is that we have safe block hash currently pointing to finalized, to the finalized hash. So we either should, this will happen until we have get safe head implementation on CL
that's
side.
the opposite. I think it's the head and the head and safe head are equivalent right now.
Oh, really? Sorry for confusion. Yeah, I was just going to suggest.
Yeah, so there's actually work on the consensus layer side that I think is ongoing. We can catch up on that in the call next week, but I believe they're trying to kind of make sure the engineering requirements are tractable with respect to the algorithm.
One quick concern on safe head. So the safe head formula, right, basically means that the safe head does not progress if more than 50% of validators are offline. But like the whole point of having something other, like actually having the chain and not just doing LMD is so that we can say us have a chain that keeps progressing in that case. So do we want to try to account for that in any way?
I mean, that's an argument for keeping latest as is.
Right, or it's an argument for modifying safe so that it only takes into account what it's based on recently online validators or something like that.
I mean, shouldn't this be a manual intervention by the user? Because like that's literally what SafeHead is trying to protect you against. Like say you are on the minority fork, then what you're suggesting is literally not safe. Like that is exactly Like you will be on the 10% chain because your optical fiber went offline or something, and now your
Right, but
safe
then
head
the
says,
same,
oh, this is safe.
but that's already a situation where you're assuming like high latency that's causing you to not see the majority chain, right? So safe head is already conditional on that.
It would in practice protect you from that though. Like it would in practice exactly in this situation stop that. Like, also it's true that I guess you can't prove safety under this condition, but it would protect you from exactly that. So I mean, my feeling is that this should be a manual user intervention. Like the situation you describe should be me as a user saying, yeah, I checked, this is not due to a catastrophic outage of like a networking split between US and Europe. It is instead because a majority client went offline due to a bug. So I want to trust this chain.
I don't know how I feel about intuitively how I feel about that. Like I think that does really move away from how we've been treating the like the head of the chain under the circumstances so far.
Right. But isn't a network split the most likely thing that leads to such a condition?
It depends. Like I think there could also be lots of nodes going offline at the same time.
We should probably have this conversation out of the call.
Yeah.
I guess we can use just the merge general channel to flesh this out.
Sure.
Yeah, I think if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, but this particular discussion is consensus layer, right? And just whatever this layer feeds the execution client is what the execution client will present.
Yes.
Okay.
Cool. Anything else on Kintsugi, or sorry, Kiln or the merge? Okay. Next up, we have a new EIP for beacon chain withdrawals, which uses a push format. Danny and Alex are the authors. I don't know if Alex, oh yeah, both of them are on the call. Yeah, do either of you want to give a quick rundown about the changes?
Yeah, I can. So last time we talked about withdrawals that would be implemented in this pool style, where the user would have some proofs, there'd be some information committed to in the EVM, and then you could affect the withdrawal. Danny actually did an analysis of how the spec was written, and basically based on that, that kind of got us, more confident in a place where we could move to a push style withdrawal, where the idea is basically, when the conditions are met on the beacon chain, you could imagine these withdrawals are sort of forced into the head of a execution block, and then validate it that way. You can read the EIP, but the main thing is a new transaction type, a new EIP 2718 transaction type that is treated pretty specially. Rather than having the EVM execution, it essentially just is an instruction for a balance transfer or a balance increase. Yeah, the one thing that I think we want to do that we haven't yet with this EIP is add logs. That was the one thing most people are doing so far with these types of withdrawals. And otherwise, yeah, I guess the main question here is just, does this general approach sound good to everyone with this new transaction type, with the new semantics? And yeah, Danny, was there anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, the document I shared here, pretty much in the spec for the validator that defines these credentials, which are these so-called ETH1 withdrawal credentials that can be deployed on mainnet today, it says that code would be executed. So we did analysis to see if anyone's actually depending on that. Because if they were heavily, that would kind of preclude this and really need pull to be handle gas accounting and things. It doesn't seem to be the case. So I think it does open this up and open up the being able to change this withdrawal credential definition. But yeah, it's pretty much the consensus layer, maintaining a queue of these withdrawal receipts and dequeuing them into the execution layer, and that being a consensus layer validity condition that the exact proper type 3 transactions are put into that execution layer block, and the execution layer just does the balance updates accordingly. No signatures and things or proofs required. Mikhail?
Yeah, I think that this is simple on the L side, but one thing here, I understand why withdrawal operation is made as a transaction to reuse already existing mechanism and probably reduce the complexity, but I think that semantically withdrawal is not a transaction, because what we usually use for a transaction is the application layer transaction, and withdrawal operation is the not an application layer stuff. It's more in protocol thing. So I think it would make sense to have like a separate separate list of operations, separate list of withdrawals, and yeah, just could make things more clear in code and more clear, like less conditions to check. So we have a separate list, which is checked by consensus layer, and it doesn't need to, to be combined with the transactions list. So that's what's on mind.
Right.
I think there's minor benefit, I think, in having them included as transactions, just because tooling that already exists for tracking deposits and withdrawals on chain, just like tracking ETH and the movement of ETH and whatnot, will all just kind of just work more or less, or at the very least, you'll see a new transaction type that you now know you need to deal with. Whereas if we put it somewhere else, it very easily gets missed by tools that are trying to aggregate. This is minor, not a
yeah. And right now on the consensus layer, we do track it in a separate list, and there's a couple of different designs, but you could pass it as a separate list on the engine API, and then the execution layer could then construct the execution layer block in whatever way we decide is reasonable. I think right now it's a type 3 transaction after some discussions with Geth. And I do think that's a reasonable approach, but if people wanted to make a new kind of system operation list and deal with it differently, I'm open to it. But I think there's less friction in doing it as a type 3 transaction.
Oh, Andrew?
Yeah, I would like to have a more comprehensive document, because here in this EIP, I see only very limited set of changes only concerning the execution layer. Personally, I'm uncomfortable implementing this without understanding the entire picture, what's done on the consensus layer, what are the security guarantees. Basically, I like how the other EIP 4844 sharp blob transaction is specified. It concerns both layers, and I think going forward in general, it would be nice to have if it's a set of changes concerning both layers, that they should be all specified in a single document.
So I do have the consensus layer specified. It's in a PR, because that's ultimately where it needs to live, because that's the way that spec is written. Certainly there can be more exposition in EIPs, and I think that is a conversation we need to have. I mean, in the merge EIP itself, it's not. In the merge EIP itself, it kind of has there are these events, and you just listen to these events, and the entirety of that beacon chain functionality is not specified there, and is instead specified kind of in an ancillary reflective spec. But I'm open to, like, this is more about EIP process. There is, the functionality is defined, and I'll link to it in a comment on there so that you can go look at it. Ultimately, if we define it in there, we're gonna have to define it somewhere else as well. And so I'm a bit hesitant to be writing things down in two places.
Because right now, like, what are the security guarantees? I just personally don't understand them. Is that no malicious player includes such transactions? So to me, it seems a bit raw, very raw at the moment.
Well, I'm going to point you to the reflection of the consensus layer specs. Quite frankly, these are bound by literal withdrawals and ETH and validators. They're put into a queue, and they're ensured that they are precisely the correct amount is put into the execution layer. That is the functionality, and it's a consensus layer validation. But I will show you. I'll link to the PR right now.
Am I correct that this is an alternative to doing withdrawals via traditional Ethereum transaction and a contract that can validate a proof?
Correct.
Right, and not needing the beacon state rate or anything like that.
And I think for context, I remember correctly, the advantage or the argument in favor of the other one is that it doesn't require anything on the execution layer, right? Like the execution client team doesn't need to do anything at all. Is that accurate?
What do you mean? On which one?
If we go with the, it's just a special contract that just has a bunch of ETH in it. And
well, the execution layer needs to have the beacon root opcode for one, and for two, it needs to be able to send transactions from no ETH at the source, or to mint, 10 to the 10 million ETH into this contract at some fork boundary.
That's right. Okay.
Which the latter, after discussions the last couple of weeks, most people did not want to do at all.
I think my main point was we don't want to have another way to start a transaction, and so we don't have another. We don't want to have another way to start an EVM execution, and because that might add additional complexities. And so what if the transaction reverts? What if the transaction, I don't know, creates another contract?
And is there a reason that people doing withdrawals can't just be expected to have some ETH on layer one to pay for?
Yeah, the problem is if this transaction can revert, then you need to tell the consensus layer about it. And so by doing it this way, only the consensus layer tells the execution layer do this, and then there's no data flowing in the opposite direction.
Yeah, you pretty much can't do push in a sane way if it's going to be triggering code execution that is unbounded. You can do pull. And so I think those are the two options on the table.
Will this transaction type, if we go with transaction, be just banned in the mempool? So it should not be propagated, right?
Yeah, it will only be part of blocks passed from the consensus client.
Yeah,
okay, so there will be exceptions for these
transactions.
Yeah. So there will be exception in the mempool code. So if you see this transaction, just drop it and do not propagate it. Just
there's no value to it and no way to validate it.
I wouldn't even really call it a transaction. I think it should be passed in the engine API as a blob, and then we include it as a transaction into the block, but not really like use it as a
right. So in the engine API, you can have essentially a new list of system operations that the meta system of the beacon chain is dictating to put into the block, rather than I think the way conflating them with the transaction list.
The way you'd accidentally get them propagated is if a block gets uncled, or I guess we don't have uncles anymore, do we though? Yeah, okay.
If
I
a
mean,
block
you
gets,
have blocks
well,
that
if a
are
block gets
orphaned.
reorged. Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess so at least under proof of work, if a block gets uncled, all the transactions that were in the uncled block tend to get propagated across networks. Like when you receive that block, you receive all the transactions that were in it, and they just are a big list of transactions. You're like, oh, here's some new transactions. I'm gonna start spreading these out. If we're adding a new transaction type that should not spread out, that means the code will need to be added in that area, that says, when you're blasting out all the transactions you saw in a block, don't include these, unless the block is actually mined, in which case do include them. And it just gets weird. It feels weird.
It's not hard to do that.
Yeah, but I mean, any exceptional argument like that, any exceptional condition like that does lend argument to like making it a new system operations list rather than transaction. But
yeah.
I don't have the depth to say which one is more reasonable. My intuition is the type 3 transaction, but I could be convinced otherwise.
I think I'm very, very weakly in preference of a system operations list, but very weak at the moment.
Yeah, I'm also weakly in favor of system operation because we're doing a lot of like precondition checking on transactions, and we like, yeah, I think we have to implement it, to prototype it, and see what works, what creates like mess.
Alex, you did do something of a prototype, right?
Yeah, I didn't touch any gossiping or networking, but essentially it has the transaction types. I mean, it's super streamlined because it is just another transaction type. There's like one minor check to say, hey, if this is one of these type 3 transactions, then just do a balance increase. Otherwise, hop into the EVM. I thought it was not that bad. I'll go grab a link.
Are there other system operations we have in mind anywhere on our current roadmap?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that.
Like even 5 or 10 years down the road, like is there anything that we're thinking about that would also fall into this category?
I can't think of anything immediately.
So not system operations, but account abstraction uses some kind of user operation that is also gossiped separately and bundled into transactions, right?
Right, but those ultimately make it into normal transactions, right?
Yes, but not sure. But maybe when included to the block, and before that they live as separate entities. But I'm not entirely sure.
Right, there's a comment from Proto in the chat about how L2s also have a similar concept where, when you deposit funds from L1 to L2, it's kind of similar than depositing or moving from the beacon chain back to the execution layer. So perhaps if the mechanism kind of can be reused, that might be interesting. I guess in terms of next steps here, is it worth trying to prototype a sort of system operations version of this, and perhaps having both side by side can kind of help decide?
I'm happy to do so, but does anyone actually want to see that?
Yeah, I don't want to.
Yeah, I think it makes more sense. I agree with Marius, and that it makes more sense to have it rather than transactions as kind of system operations. And my understanding is that engine API should definitely be involved. It just so it's not kind of the EAP is not complete. I don't see any mentioning of engine API at all here.
The engine API has not made it into EAPs before, but instead has these kind of like operations or these events from the consensus layer. So it would be the expansion of an event like the new block event or whatever that would also have these operations in it. So we can.
Well, my point is it doesn't have to be like verbatim in a single document, but at least there should be references so that when you have a single document that references, it has all the necessary references that I can have a single point of entry. And then I'm able to understand the entire picture, what changes on the consensus layer, what changes on the engine API, what changes on the execution layer. Otherwise, it seems like separate bits without any unifying picture. Okay, sorry, that's my 2 cents.
Right. I do. Yeah.
I think what Andrew's asking for is the thing that I always push core EIP authors to build, which is don't include that in the EIP, please. But big EIPs like this definitely benefit from having like a HackMD article or something that ties it all together, like Tim did with 15559. I use that as my example always. It was an excellent example of tying the whole picture together in some meta document, and the EIP can remain just the spec.
Right. This is, I guess, kind of it.
Yeah, we can put all the pieces together in one place.
Yeah, I guess we need a withdrawal
as well.
Sort of meta spec. Yeah.
The downside is it requires a bunch of writing, and no one likes doing that.
Yeah. So I guess
not opposed.
Yeah. Does that make sense in terms of next steps, though, to prototype the systems operations version and to put together a kind of more comprehensive meta spec?
Yeah, and the document, the consensus layer and engine API, I think will look almost exactly the same, whether it's the system operations or not. And then there'll be 2 options on the execution layer, so 2 EIPs choice at that point.
To echo the question that was asked earlier, would a prototype actually sway anyone one way or the other? Or people, I agree that we shouldn't have someone waste their time building a prototype if that will not sway any opinions.
Maybe it's worth writing down in kind of a stripped down EIP before doing the prototype.
Sure, just see if there's any hard edges.
I guess, yeah, Marius, Andrew, would that sway? I guess it's mostly for your consumption. So any thoughts on that? I don't know if you're speaking, Marius, but we can't hear you on Zoom.
I'm not speaking.
Okay, sorry. It shows a green box around your face.
Yeah, I'm happy either way. I looked at Alex's PR and yeah, it looks pretty good. So I would be also okay with having the transaction style. I don't know.
Well, let's put the meta spec together, have a proposal for the engine API, finish the networking components and log components of the existing EIP, and get some feedback from there. And then if people feel strongly about, after they get to chew on it a little bit, a different operations list, we can address that at that point.
That sounds good. Cool. Just because, yeah, we're starting to run short on time. Yeah, that seems like a good next step. We do have a couple more EIPs, so I'll move to the shard blob transactions. basically last time we discussed this, everyone seemed to think this was a very valuable thing to have in Shanghai, but there were questions about like how easy it would be to actually implement this, what it would take. And a few people implemented a prototype during ETH Denver. Proto was one of them, and he posted an update on the agenda today. Do you want to take a couple minutes to just walk through the prototype you implemented, and then you had a couple questions you wanted to address on the call?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Tim. So hello, everyone. We're presenting EIP 4844 titled Shard Block Transactions. So not to be confused with 4488, the older call data expansion thing. This just focuses on this separate data. It works differently, so bear with me. I'll summarize the EIP. This introduces a new transaction type. The transaction type has all the same features as a regular 15F9 transaction has. However, it adds this additional data outside of the transaction. This data is not encoded within the execution layer. This data is instead stored within the consensus node and can be pruned after being available for a sufficient amount of time. This data is formatted as these field elements. So this means we can do this KZG commitment over the data instead of regular hashing. And this EIP also introduces 2 precompiles and an opcode to verify this data within the EVM in an efficient way. And then this EIP is also forward compatible with the full sharding design, where we introduce data availability sampling. And then the tricky points with this EIP are really that we are introducing this transaction type that has this additional data that lives with the transaction when it's produced, when it's propagated, but not within the execution payload. But then the data is stored as this blob, and it's referenced in the beacon block. It's referenced in the transaction, but it's not stored along with it. It's temporarily retained within the consensus layer node for this shorter term availability. And then in agenda, I listed a few points. How we can extend this EIP, and if this is the right approach. This EIP 2718 that first introduced type transactions describes how to encode these transactions. But now that we have this additional data, we might want to define how this network payload differs from the encoding as presented within the regular transactions list. And then how do we relay this blob data? We could relay it with the transaction, or there may be more efficient ways. And then similar to the withdrawal transaction type, this also looks at implementing the transaction type with a different encoding with SSE. And then we also have this question how we will introduce KZG commitments into Ethereum. We have been looking at how we can facilitate the trusted setup, how we can introduce this in various different clients. There are libraries that offer this KZG functionality, and we are looking to minimize it as much as possible so that it's actually a really simple extension to the BOS work that's already present in clients. And then from there, we need to work on DevNets. And we've built this prototype for the execution layer, for the consensus layer. And I'd like your review on those implementations so we can improve the EIP.
Thanks for sharing all this. There's a question about iClient in the chat. I guess, yeah, we can start there, where the KZG commitment is probably the biggest or like most contentious thing as part of this. So yeah, what are client team's thoughts about doing this in like basically the next year?
the commitment scheme because of the kind of cryptographic complexity of those operations and just needing new and robust libraries. Is that what you mean, likely?
I think it's basically the same argument that kept BLS from getting integrated for 2 years.
Right, but KZG is mostly BLS, right?
Sure. So like if we still don't have BLS.
But we do have BLS in production. We just don't have EVM operations. We do, like, we use it quite a bit, you know, millions of operations.
Not on the execution layer though, right?
Yeah.
Correct, but not in the EVM, right?
Andrew has his hand up.
Yeah, I just, I guess I missed the original discussion about BLS on the execution layer. Yeah, to my mind, there is already a better proven library that can be used. So I'm not that worried because, yeah, it already exists. So from my perspective, we can implement it in Aragon relatively easily. There are a couple of corrections, small things really, so that in the signature, in the EIP, it uses V, but V is this legacy field that blends chain ID and Y parity, and we should use Y parity similar to EIP 1559 transactions. And also in get intrinsic gas, a couple of things are omitted. The create cost for create transactions and the cost of access lists. I made the comments on the magicians. It's just minor corrections.
Yes, thank you for your comments. We'll get back to those on the forum. In general, all the functionality is just the same cost, same everything as with EIP 1559. If there are differences, then we'll try to reduce those. The only real addition here is that we're adding this additional data. So this list of versioned hashes, and those hashes refer to the data that's then propagated along with the transaction.
Can you expand a bit on the opcode and the two precompiles? What do they do?
So the precompiles are to verify this type of KZG commitment. There's one way to verify a single point of data, and there's another way to verify all of it at the same time. And the idea really here is that we want to not introduce the stateless requirement to the EVM, where we are directly accessing this transaction data, but instead we provide a proof and the original data as call data into the EVM, and then you can prove that it matches the KZG commitment. And so we can prune away this information and the EVM execution will still work. The blob data is really independent from the EVM.
There's a question in the chat about concerns about history growth. Yeah, Proto, do you want to share your thoughts about that?
So the transaction type does the same thing as 1559. So in that regard, it doesn't grow more. And then the additional data, the blob, that's retained in the consensus layer, not in the execution layer. So it doesn't affect history growth by all that much within the execution layer. There's this list of versioned hashes, but it's a maximum of 16 hashes. So that's really not that much compared to all these other limits within the EVM. The real growth is in the consensus layer. And this is limited to, say, a month of data. And even when we have large blobs and when we say would have a megabyte of data per block, then with a month of data, this is still capped to a maximum and doesn't grow out of bounds. And these parameters, like for how long do we retain the data and for how many of these blobs do we want to start with, these are up for discussion.
Got it.
Yeah, it's worth just noting that like data availability that is needed for rollups doesn't mean persistent data storage. It means ensuring there aren't these like data withholding attacks and that those that want the data within some bound time can get that data, and then it's made available, but not that it's then persisted forever, similar to, dissimilar to the chain persistent requirements that the proof of work network has right now.
Guillaume, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just had a quick question about the KZG again. Like, I mean, I used it for vocal trees in the past. It's I'm confident it's not such a big deal, but we moved away from that for vocal trees. How about using IPA instead of KZG? Has that been considered?
Yeah, so I actually wrote a big ETH research post considering it. The answer is basically that doing data availability sampling and all of that associated stuff just gets much harder with IPAs because they don't have a lot of the nice algebraic properties that KZG does.
Okay.
Right, so one of the features of this EIP is that it tries to be forward compatible with the full sharding roadmap. And central to that is data availability sampling, which has been designed around KZG and optimized for KZG. And so by building on top of that, we are forward compatible and we can roll out sharding without further changes to the execution layer. It will just be consensus layer changes after this.
Right, so a nice way to think about it from that full sharding map is really black boxing. Is data available? That's this function that the consensus layer has to call. And in this proposal, you just download the data. But in subsequent proposals, you swap that function out and do data availability sampling as there was more and more data. There's been some questions about a trusted setup. Yes, KZG commitments in the scheme would require a trusted setup of relatively low number of powers, something on the order of like 16. Actually, I think it requires 12, but we would do 16 to handle quite a bit of growth from there in the future. And this is something that would be required for sharding no matter what. So it's something that the EF is looking into doing right now. And kind of surveying the landscape of previous powers of Tau that have been done, and looking to reuse some of that tech, but also to, because it's a low number of powers, likely doing some sort of browser-based ceremony being available to get much wider participation than in prior ceremonies. But work in progress.
Low power just means the computation required to participate is lower, right?
Yeah, like our estimates is you could do this in like a minute and a half on your browser, as opposed to doing it in a highly optimized compiled thing that still took 20 minutes or something.
Great. Just, yeah, again, because we're a bit short on time. In terms of next steps here, obviously there's been like some, technical feedback on various aspects of it, but are there, I guess, what are, people's biggest, like, what are the things that people would most want to see to consider pursuing this further?
So I just want to state, it seems pretty critical that some sort of scaling relief is provided in Shanghai. I think our two options are repricing and modifying call data, which has chain growth issues and also isn't really elegant with respect to the future sharding map, whereas this brings in probably quite a bit more complexity, but is synergistic and essentially it lays the foundation for extending it to be compatible, with full sharding. So it kind of lays the foundations and kind of iteratively gets us to sharding. So it's really a complexity trade-off versus the elegance of this integrating into the sharding roadmap in general. And I think it'd be very valuable to get client implementers' take on the complexity here. There is that prototype that Proto and others worked on. Yeah, I mean, getting Peter, getting Martin, getting anyone a deeper look at this, I think would be really valuable.
Edgar?
Yeah, and I just wanted to say, for context, maybe just kind of going forward, I think the important thing is really just, as Danny was saying, that we basically really want to do something for Shanghai for scaling. And I think the one thing we want to avoid is everyone agreeing that this would be nice. And I think right now it sounds like all the client teams are agreeing that this would be nice. And then only 4 or 5 months from now, people kind of get to the point where they're like, yeah, but unfortunately it's just too much complexity. We just won't be able to do that for Shanghai. And at that point, it will be like very late to try and simplify or try and do other things. So like, basically the idea would just be like, ideally we would want to get feedback on how realistic is this as soon as possible. And I think, for example, Lightclient had looked into simplifying that, removing the KCG part, which wouldn't be great because then you lose some of the forward compatibility, you lose some of the usefulness for ZK rollup. So it's not great, but at least it would be something we could try to do. If this is just too complex, but like it would be really important to get like feedback on how realistic, not just how desirable, but how realistic is this for like a timeline that would have this in Shanghai at the end of this year.
And I think one thing I'll add to that is, we've already committed to one thing, well, which is actually a set of EIPs, but like to the whole, EVM object format, I guess call it a feature for Shanghai. We have these discussions about beacon chain withdrawals, which clearly are like a non-trivial thing to do no matter what approach we take. And then we have this. So, just those three, like they're not EIPs or set of EIPs, like those three features alone are kind of already a very large hard fork. And that's probably something like, I guess, as soon as the merge code is wrapped up, that we need to like consider is, if we did those three, is that even realistic? If not, what else can we do?
Real quick, removing the KCG, that would essentially be using a different commitment scheme currently to reduce complexity, knowing that full data is going to be downloaded and you don't need to do data availability sampling. And then in the future, you would essentially deprecate that transaction type for a new transaction type that had KZG commitments that then allowed for the data availability sampling. Is that the idea?
Yeah, that's how I understood. I think
and
maybe Proto.
The commitments are already versioned in the way we specified it. So using a different commitment scheme would basically making version 0 of the commitment scheme being a hash-based one.
Right. But we'd have to deprecate that commitment scheme come sharding because you wouldn't be able to do the data availability sampling.
Yes.
The transaction type still has to encode it in one way or another and validate it in one way or another, even though it's versioned within the EVM. So there will be some difference.
It also would not allow the evaluation at a 0.1, which would mean it would be much less useful for ZK rollups.
Okay, I guess, yeah, just to time box this, because we do have 2 other topics to cover before the end of the call. Where's the best place, I guess, for people to like review this and engage? Do we have like a channel on Discord for this or something?
There is the sharded data channel, which we can revive originally for the full sharding roadmap, but this is a stepping stone. So let's start there. Okay. And then there are 2 prototypes, one on the execution layer, one on the consensus layer. If you're specialized in either one of those, then please have a look and reach out and give your feedback.
Cool. Yeah, let's use the sharded data channel. Okay. Thanks a lot for everyone on this. Next up, there's another EIP that we had discussed briefly for Shanghai, EIP 3651, which proposes to to treat the Coinbase address as warm. We have William on the call. Yeah, do you want to give a quick summary and I guess reason why you'd like to see this in Shanghai?
Yes, for Berlin, we added EIP 2929, which initialized the access list to include origin, the recipients, and the set of all precompiles. This missed Coinbase, unfortunately. So the proposal is to add Coinbase to this list. It would reduce the cost of direct Coinbase transfers, which are used by conditional transaction fees, such as systems like Flashbots, where there's an auction system often, but You're trying to pay the miner conditionally only if your transaction succeeds or does what you want. And I currently believe these are overpriced because we already modify the Coinbase's ETH balance and account several times during the block to receive the block reward and the transaction fees. So by making Coinbase warm, it should already be correctly priced to reduce that cost. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm curious, what are clients' thoughts on this? Oh, Andrew?
Yeah, I think it's a simple and useful proposal. So I think we can do it in Shanghai.
Anton? Oh, sorry, then Anton, then Maris. Oh, Anton, you're back on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. Hi, everyone. I have also the question regarding this EIP. As far as I remember, each call with value attached will cost also 9K of gas extra. This maybe also should be reviewed, maybe with another improvement proposal, because this is also a lot.
Yes, I agree with that. That 9,000 for ETH transfers might make sense in a cold context, but not in a warm context. And this should be reviewed in the future.
So in the Verkle tree, right, gas cost EIP, this is one of the companion EIPs to the Verkle tree EIP. I do have a proposal that basically removes all of those kind of special purpose gas costs and moves them all into the cold warm system. So one of the side effects will be that like warm ETH moving will be cheaper.
Thank you.
And Marius, you were going to say something earlier?
Yes. Yes, even though it benefits MEV people, and I don't like MEV people, I'll support this EIP. It was an oversight in the original one, and I think it's a no-brainer to include it.
Is it? I guess, am I right in thinking this is literally like a one-line change in a way where we just add a parameter to the list of things that is warm in 2929?
It's not a one-line change, but like maybe 5 or 10. But yes.
Plus, like, you know, hundreds of lines of tests output.
Right. I guess, and you know, we already have included a couple similar fixes, if you want, in Shanghai. So like, I'm trying to pull them up right now. Basically, push 0 seemed like another small one, limiting the and metering init code. So, you know, is this something that people feel confident that we can kind of include as another small win? And that, I guess, probably wouldn't affect our ability to ship these larger features we were just talking about? Or, yeah. I guess to put it differently, does anyone feel like if we did do this, you know, it might impact whether we do blob transactions, beacon chain withdrawals?
I think we can pretty easily include this without it increases the amount of testing we have. Every EIP exponentially increases the amount of testing we have to do, but it's not that bad.
Okay. I guess any objections with moving it to CFI for Shanghai and starting to implement it when we start the Shanghai DevNets?
Yeah, I mean it's basically repeating what Vitalik said, but because of the Verkle tree stuff that comes in the fork right after Shanghai, that kind of makes this whole thing moot. Yeah, I just wonder, and in fact, it's also a comment about the next EIP. I just wonder if it really makes sense to bother doing this when it's going to be yeah, sorry, I forgot the word, but it's not going to be used afterwards.
I think my one counter argument to that is just that, well, optimistically, vertical trees will be included, in the fork after Shanghai. History has shown that we are not super great at predicting our future roadmaps, and so for something super easy, there's an undefined duration.
Actually, the gas changes are supposed to happen in Shanghai.
No, I don't think it's true, because that entails a refactoring, a fundamental refactoring on the data structures. So I don't think that gas changes for the vertical tree can happen in Shanghai.
Right, and I don't know, just I guess to be clear, the only thing we've agreed so far to include in Shanghai were the 4 EIPs basically related to EVM object formats, so 3540, 3670, which was the EOF code validation. Then we added these 2 other small ones, the push 0 instruction and limiting and metering init code. And we had some sort of, I guess, soft commitments towards including obviously beacon chain withdrawals and some kind of scaling solution, like we just discussed, whether that's a whole new system or something more simple like reducing the call data cost. Yeah, and so, and I guess, yeah, it's worth noting those 3 things, like EOF, beacon chain withdrawals, and blob transactions are all pretty significant. So I'm personally a bit skeptical of including any other big thing until we have more clarity on those. But yeah, I guess the question is can we include this? I guess there seems to be some consensus that we can include this small change. The question is it worthwhile to include it if in 9 months after it gets obsoleted? That's, I don't know, maybe quickly we can cover that before we move on, and hopefully stay a couple minutes after for the last EIP.
I think it makes sense to include it.
Yeah, I don't, but
I guess, do any other client teams have an opinion on this?
Fine to include from Aragon.
Yeah, from a basic perspective, it doesn't seem like it's going to be a significant additional load, but it could be one of those death by 1,000 cut things.
Right. And Thomas, or anyone else from Mastermind actually?
Oh, I don't have a hard stance about it, but I think it's fine to include it.
Okay. So I guess, and to be clear, when we say include it, we're moving it to considered for inclusion, which is this in-between state, which will get it prototyped on the devnets and whatnot. So I think it probably makes sense to move it there. Try to get it on the devnets. If we do see that for whatever reason this adds some overhead that is just too great, we can always choose to remove it. And that's probably true of all the other small kind of quick fixes. If there is an exponential testing increase by just having these small fixes, we can obviously decide to just focus on the larger changes. But it seems reasonable to at least move it to considered for inclusion and try to get it on devnets. Okay, we're already at time. I appreciate if people have a couple extra minutes, we can discuss Anton's EIP, which is EIP 3978. Appreciate you kind of bearing with us through the call, Anton. Do you want to take a couple minutes to just describe the EIP and yeah, why you think it's valuable?
Yes. Hi everyone. I with my colleague Michael first time participate in such a call. So yeah, we proposed this EIP 3978, which basically reprice the reverted transactions. We discover reverted operations, I would say, because we discovered that in case of revert, all gather fund is being erased, and users they pay for reverted operations same price as for persisted operations. This sounds really unfair because it increases costs of reverted transactions. And in general, it seems that we can switch this behavior to keep access costs and refund the modification costs. Yeah, basically that's it. We enumerated the most expensive operations and proposed to use access cost for these operations in case they will be reverted.
Thanks. There is a discussion to link in the EIP, so we can have like longer discussions there. But do people just have quick comments or questions before we wrap up? Do Andrew, then Guillaume.
I think it's, well, definitely not for Shanghai. And in general, Aragon's perspective is that instead of tweaking, like making some small tweaks to the gas schedule, we should concentrate on bigger scalability improvements. Yeah, so we are kind of tentatively against this.
Got it. Guillaume?
Yeah, same argument. I mean, that I made before, and what Andrew just said. It's this one is going to be very, very, very difficult to, or at least very intricate to build, and it's becoming pointless after the Verkle tree update. So I would really be against this one.
Got it.
And I totally agree with Guillaume on this one.
Got it. Anton, so you have your hand up again.
Yeah, one more thing here I want to add. There is an interesting example. If some DEX is swapping user assets, it will be cheaper to return funds back to the user if swap not happened for some reason like deadline or bad rate. It will be cheaper to return funds back to user to keep at least some gas refund instead of reverting whole transaction. This sounds a little bit strange and ridiculous.
So, am I correct in understanding that if we don't make this change and dApps optimize, then they will optimize for the more operationally expensive choice, which is to do more work? Is that correct? And actually write data?
That's right.
That's unfortunate. I do think that this change is correct, like it is the right thing to do, but I do worry to echo what others have said. I think the complexity is high, and with Verkle trees kind of doing the same thing functionally, it's much more questionable than warm Coinbase.
So I guess, yeah, clearly there's not like consensus for this. And like we just discussed, there's a ton of other things that seem to have really high consensus for Shanghai plus Verkle trees. It's kind of slated, slated for after. I guess if people do want to discuss this, there is a discussion to link in the EIP, but we won't be moving it to CFI for Shanghai. We're already over time. The last thing on the agenda, like I mentioned at the very beginning, we do have a call next Friday at this time, so 1400 UTC, to discuss the naming of the client releases for the merge on the execution layer side. If people want to join that, there's a link in the agenda. Anything else anybody wanted to cover quickly before we wrap up? Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks, William, Anton, and the others for coming on to present EIPs. And we will see you in 2 weeks.
Thanks.
Thank you. See you.
Thanks.
Thanks
Bye.
all. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. See you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.